as I suspect someone has told you, I'm Randy Picker, and I'm a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Thank you so much for letting me do this this way. We've got a family trip starting tomorrow, and so there was no way I could come to Brazil right now, sometime in the future. But I'm really happy to have a chance to talk with you today. Let's hope the video works, and then we're going to try to do a live Skype call for the second half of this. And if all goes well, we'll get both pieces of that in. So I was asked to talk about digital platforms. I want to talk about, I think, the history associated with that. I think I'll get us to the present day. I think we're at a very interesting moment. Everyone knows that. But I think the history is a little underappreciated. And I think seeing how antitrust has functioned in the past in these spaces is so important and should inform how we think about what we do today. So, and as you think about the world we live in today, I think there are these three sort of key arcs as I describe them. So the emergence of semiconductors and Gordon Moore's prediction as to what would happen there. Obviously the internet, and then the fact that we live in this wireless world. I think those three coming together have sort of defined where we are, and I want to talk those through a little bit. So where do I start, though? Where I start is actually right at the edge of World War II. So there was a great need during World War II to calculate lots of numbers, to fire guns at a distance and make that effective. We were using lots of human beings, and we called them computers to do that, lots of women often. Given that the men were at the front. The women back home did a lot of those calculations. We had some analog machines before that. Indeed, those were the great machines of World War II in some sense. But we started to make our first move to digital. The British were doing that in a hidden way with their great cryptography machines. And the United States then, really after the war was over, went public. With a new machine that had been built in that framework, a machine that the history knows as ENIAC. And as you can see here from this story, this is February 1946. The War Department, as it was known then, had done a demonstration of the robot. It's interesting to look at this history. You see the word robot used with some frequency. And we obviously still talk about robots today. Are we at the edge of that? With robots and AI. Okay, but the new machine here and the technology of this machine is really quite extraordinary in some sense. As the vacuum tube, which was a sort of a glass tube that had been in radios. They pulled together 18,000 of those and very cleverly built this machine to do digital work, digital binary on and off. ENIAC was actually, I think, a decimal machine. But this huge machine, you can see some of the figures here. But that really was our first digital moment. And ENIAC really takes us down the path of the digital world we live in. But there was another critical step. It wasn't clear that the vacuum tube really would work very well. Indeed, some people were surprised that ENIAC was even able to work. Bell Labs, right after World War II in 1947, discovers the device that would define the world of today. And that device was the transistor. It was the first effort to replace vacuum tubes with semiconductors. Semiconductors and that technology is the world we live in today. It was the great move from the vacuum tube to the semiconductor, and Bell Labs invented this around Christmas of 1947. The second version in January of 1948, demonstrated that in July of 1948. And that's absolutely a key digital moment to really set us off on the path that we're in today. Now, Gordon Moore would later predict, this is from 1965, a very famous article, about exactly how fast that technology would develop. And the fact that it sort of develops in an exponential way turns out to be very important to the way in which these machines have become faster and faster and faster. And the Bell Labs transistor really launched us on what would then become Moore's Law. Okay, I haven't said anything about antitrust, and maybe we should do that. And you see I sort of am numbering these digital moments. So digital moment number 3 is the United States brings an antitrust suit against AT&T in 1949. This antitrust suit is focusing on the idea that it's really hard to regulate AT&T as an entity, given the fact that there are these operating companies, the local telephone companies, which are regulated utilities in each of their states, but they're buying all of this equipment from an unregulated supplier owned by AT&T, Western Electric. Very hard to tell whether, as it were, the local phone companies are being overcharged. And the solution to that, given the complexity of AT&T, is, in the government's view, DOJ's view at least, is to break up AT&T, pull out Western Electric, and solve the problem that way. And so the government moves down this path of this epic antitrust suit against AT&T, and it's situated, as I just described, in some sort of basic regulatory problem. I do not think it was targeting the transistor technology in any way, shape, or form. But in the midst of that lawsuit, as Bell Labs is rolling out this new technology, they start to license it on a fairly free basis. And part of that's driven by the fact that we're now in the middle of the Korean War. Bell had military contracts, which I think effectively required it to engage in a kind of second licensing. As we won't see in this talk, I'm in the middle of a much longer book on all these issues. There's lots of licensing in this space over time. So it's a little uncertain as to what happened and to why AT&T, Bell, was engaging in this licensing. But the 1949 antitrust lawsuit gets resolved in 1956 with a final judgment. And most critically, that effectively opens up the Bell patents to the world, royalty-free on the existing ones, as you can see, a non-discriminatory basis going forward. So we're really right in the early days of this critical technology, and all of a sudden it's available to the world to be used. And so that creates a kind of technological commons, really right at the edge of this new technology. And the very next day, after settling with AT&T, the government settled with IBM. And did so quite consciously with the idea that we were at the edge of this new electronic age, and that these lawsuits that the government had brought against AT&T and IBM, and you see a mention here of an RCA lawsuit, that those settlements would effectively create a kind of inflection point to facilitate competition at this time. Now, I mentioned the patent terms in connection with the 1956 final judgment. Note also, though, and I think this is really important, that AT&T was quarantined. That part of the way to solve the regulatory problem of a mix of regulated entities and non-regulated entities was simply to block AT&T from going into other fields. And most critically, it means that we took what was clearly a firm that would have been an aggressive competitor in the computer market, and we took them off the table just at the point that computer competition was going to take place. And I think there are consequences associated with that, though we'll get to those in just a second. So, not breakup of AT&T, but the final judgment limiting AT&T to being a communications firm, blocking them from computer, opening up transistors, a parallel opening up of the IBM technology. Where would the world go next? And the answer is sort of here. So on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was the very first artificial satellite. And that was a remarkable technical achievement. You see this New York Times story talking about the understandable Soviet pride in that. That's completely sensible. Make sure you see the other part of that story, which is that the satellite was one thing, the missile rocket technology to lift that satellite was something else, and that scared the United States. It scared us because it seemed to be that the Soviet Union was possibly ahead with regard to ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the like. And so not only was Sputnik this technical achievement, but it seemed like it was a possible military achievement. And so the question was, how would the United States respond to that? And part of what the United States did was to say, we're not putting enough effort into basic research and understanding technology. And so what is now known as DARPA, what was then known as ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, was sort of a military arm outside of the three branches that would focus on research with the expectation that most of that research, but not all of it, would have military applications. So DARPA is formed, as you can see, in 1958. It goes off to do a variety of things, but most critically for our purposes, so we're going to take that one step later, but we'll do this in just a second. Most critically for our purposes, DARPA starts to move towards some sort of computerized network, starts to do that in 63. That really comes to fruition in 1969, and we'll get there in just a second. Digital moment number 5. So the electronics opening created by the settlements in 1956, the question is who was going to run into that? Not AT&T, the quarantine made that sure, but IBM was obviously a very successful company, really in the tabulating equipment business. They were building computers, they were moving into electronics. But there was a meaningful competition at that point. But in 1964, they introduced their great computer, the System 360. I think it's fair to think of that as a kind of computer platform. The System 360 had a number of different combinations and a certain consistency across those. And the System 360 was a huge bet. Fortune magazine at that point referred to it, or maybe a year later, as sort of a $5 billion bet. So an extraordinary private effort to build these new machines. And IBM did. And IBM succeeded. How much did they succeed? They succeeded enough that by January of 1969, the United States government sued them for monopolization. That's an interesting lawsuit. We'll see what happens to that lawsuit in just a second. But I want to make sure we see this idea that while it's easy to talk about the virtues in the 1956 final judgment with regard to opening up the patents, though again, maybe the military contract would have required that. Again, maybe AT&T would have licensed those anyhow. So it's a little hard to disentangle exactly what the antitrust contribution was to that in 1956. Clearly what the final judgment did was block AT&T from these markets. That's just one firm, but when you take away sophisticated firms from markets that we think might be, I want to say naturally oligopolistic, how many firms were going to be able to compete in these very large machines? I don't know, but that causes IBM's success, but IBM builds this great machine, the System 360, it clearly succeeds, and by 1969 the government says, you guys are monopolists. Note what this article says, it says, oh, let's have a partial breakup of IBM. So breakups, as you know, are very much part of the U.S. conversation today as we talk about Facebook and Amazon, a little less about Apple and Google in terms of breaking them up, but maybe there too. And as you saw on the slide so far, certainly there were possible breakups of Western Electric. That was what motivated the 1949 antitrust suit. And again, here, this 1969 suit, talking about breakups again. So that suit was brought in January of 1969. Sort of meanwhile, on the other side of the country, ARPA was continuing to work. And in December of 1969, the internet, I don't want to say as we know such a different internet, but in 1969, ARPA, this government agency working mainly with universities, turns on a computer network at a distance. That was called the ARPANET at that point. And the internet that we know it, eventually is built on the structure, the backbone, the infrastructure that ARPA had started to put in place really in 1963. I want to make sure we see timelines here that gives rise to this in 1969, and eventually, of course, all of that gets built out, though over time. Okay, where do we go next? So the transistor becomes the integrated circuit, becomes eventually the microprocessor. That's what we're looking at here. This is Intel's first microprocessor, the 4004. It looks like this little sort of artificial bug. But the microprocessor brings together a set of functionality. It's programmable. And again, the devices that we live on these days really has its roots in technologies, this technology and others that have come to compete with it. The next step maybe in the world we live in today occurs in 1973. That was a portable phone, 3 pounds in 1973. It's the first portable phone call. And now we're starting to see wireless on our hands, right? Wireless is radio in the 1920s, and it's television in the 1950s and 1960s. But this is wireless in our actual hands. And Motorola, based in Chicago, actually a Chicago suburb, Schaumburg, is an early mover in that space. The government sues AT&T again in 1974. Again, the regulators have found AT&T so large that they find it almost impossible to understand what's going on. And again, the solution here is to get rid of Western Electric, break it up, separate it out. Again, that was the remedy that was thought to be sensible when the suit was brought in 1949. That didn't happen in 1956. AT&T held on to Western Electric. Here we are in 1974, and we're back to that again. What are we looking at here? This is known to computer historians as the $1 trillion magazine cover. Let's just look at what it is. So this is the Altair 8800, and it was sort of a computer kit. They would sort of send you the parts, and you could construct it. My God! But this was sort of an early, as it were, personal computer. And why this is known as a $1 trillion magazine cover is that Paul Allen sees this. He has followed his friend Bill Gates, who's an undergraduate at Harvard. Paul Allen sees this magazine in a bookstore in Harvard Square Yard and goes to Bill Gates and says, "This is it. This is the future. We got to build software for it." And they do. So Gates leaves Harvard and they build software for it. And on the West Coast, Steve Wozniak sees this, and Steve Wozniak says, "I can do better than this. What is this? I can do better." And so he and his friend Steve Jobs start to head down the path that gives us Apple computers. So this is a significant artifact. And as you can see, this is Popular Electronics, January 1975. All right, we roll forward quickly. Apple does build computers. There are other early computers. The personal computer industry is at a very interesting stage from, 75 through 81, where there's interesting competition. There are new firms, and the Apple II is a great success. But IBM decides that they are going to go into this business. I've sort of skipped from mainframes to personal computers. I've skipped mini computers. Digital Equipment Corporation's the best known name there, I think. IBM had sort of not gone into that market aggressively. They were not going to make the same mistake with regard to the IBM PC. Now, a couple of key points here. So the IBM antitrust suit, and we'll get the resolution of that here in just a second, it's pending at this point. So that suit was brought in January of 1969. Now we're at August of 1981. And the suit continues to roll, which is quite remarkable. I think it's fair to say, as best I can tell, that IBM, in designing this machine, was influenced by the pendency of the suit. They wanted to go fast, but that was, I think, driven by the market and not the lawsuit. but they were willing to rely on outside components. And so they build this on a new Intel chip, new relative to the 4004 that I showed you. If you've never seen one of these machines, that's what they look like. It was not a graphical user interface, no Windows, no Macintosh, just the C prompt flashing at you and saying, please do something. And the question was always, oh my God, what do I do? There's no hard drive, that's what it says. You know, by the standards of today, it's not much of a machine, but it was an enormous success. IBM was the most important name in computing. IBM was saying this was a real market, and this sold in a way that IBM didn't expect. So a great, great success. I do want to note that this machine, when it was released, came with 3 different operating systems, one of which was a Microsoft operating system. The story of that is a great, great story. I do not have time to tell that here, so I'm not going to tell that story. But it's a killer story. In any event, the consequence of the IBM PC is that eventually what happens is a clone market emerges, so other companies start building machines that are compatible with this. They could do that in part because they could get chips from Intel, they could get the operating system from Microsoft. There was one more technical piece that was sort of tricky, but eventually, and that raises some copyright issues with regard to the BIOS, the basic input-output system, but that eventually gets all solved. And a clone market emerges. So IBM sort of loses control of, I think we should call this a platform. And the PC industry emerges. And Intel and Microsoft are the big winners here. So huge consequences there. That was released in August of 81. Now we get to 92. And on the same day again, basically, and remember in 56 it was AT&T one day, it was IBM the next day. The government says, we're going to break up AT&T and we are going to drop the IBM lawsuit. So AT&T agrees to be broken up. They've been in litigation since 74, and by 82 they've said, we're ready to get broken up. Litigation hadn't been going super well, but they had, I should say I used to work at the firm that represented AT&T, Sidley and Austin then. I was not involved, that was before my time. I was in high school when the lawsuit was brought originally. But in any event, I don't know that it was necessarily the course of the litigation. It was more the fact that AT&T was ready to separate off the local telephone companies, which didn't look that interesting, and they very much wanted to get relief from the 1956 final judgment to go into the computer business. I think they saw correctly that computers and communications were going to converge, and that they were sort of hamstrung in their ability to compete in this new space. And so they wanted to get free of that. And so cutting a deal which would break up AT&T and create these local Bell operating companies, which would be regulated and restricted and quarantined in a variety of ways, but allowing AT&T proper, as it were, to be in the long-distance market and to go into the computer business. That was a deal AT&T was willing to cut. Now, it's interesting. I think as you look at this deal in retrospect, when you look at it in 82 and 84, and the eventual breakup's done in 84, you see almost no vision about wireless. That's, I think, interesting. So there was a little bit of spectrum involved in the breakup, and it clearly got just sort of the back of the hand. The other thing is we know that AT&T goes into computers multiple times, loses billions of dollars doing that, and effectively exits that market. So the great carrot to them for agreeing to this breakup, I think proved to be completely illusory. Where do we go next? We go here. Now we're up to 1989. So a gentleman named Tim Berners-Lee is working at a nuclear facility in Switzerland called CERN. CERN can't find all of its documents. And Tim says, oh, here's an idea. Why don't we do this? we'll do this mesh proposal, and it'll involve some hypertext. This will work. This is the start of the World Wide Web. So the internet, the infrastructure has moved from 1969. Remember, ARPA started 1963, turns on the internet really in 69. The infrastructure continues to grow. Here we are 20 years later, though, and now in some sense, I don't want to call it the software side. That's a little simplistic, but for our purposes, maybe about right. The software side of it changes. And so the World Wide Web piece of this and the Berners-Lee proposal is exactly that. The browser mosaic at Champaign-Urbana, downstate in Illinois, at a state university there, University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Another national computing center there, so more federal money. Part of what you should see here is the role of private actors, the role of the government, the role of universities as all of this evolves. But this takes us on the path of creating the internet that faces us today. So now we've got the computers, now we've got the internet. We need one more piece. I keep looking at the watch, so I want to know where I am on time. We're okay, I think. So this is the United States spectrum chart. It's from 2016. I bring this up in class so that people can see what that looks like. What you want to see is how complicated it is, how much spectrum is used, how anytime we want to put spectrum to a new use, we have to figure out a way to sort of clear out the people who are there, the incumbents, and all of that's incredibly complicated. In the United States, that's all managed by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And the FCC has been doing that, and they've held this series of auctions over time. I think of this as the sort of spectrum Big Bang. This is in 1995. This is an auction relating to what they were calling at that point PCS, which was Personal Communication Services. But it really is the start of the wireless world that we live in the United States at least today. And part of what I think is interesting about this, it's going to be a little hard for you to see, I suspect, is the fact that because we had broken up AT&T and because we'd created these regional Bell operating companies, 7 very large firms, there was much more active competition when this new opportunity showed up. What would this auction look like, ask, if we had not broken up AT&T? And I think it looks very different, and the kinds of competition we were seeing there was different because instead of having one large national entity, we sort of had these 8 pretty large entities, one of which was national in scope, and the other 7 were saying, oh, here's this new opportunity. Maybe we should go compete in that space. That was 1995. I mentioned, obviously, Intel and Microsoft. Microsoft gets a lot of attention. Intel as well. I'm going to focus on Microsoft here. So the United States government sues Microsoft in 1994 for DOS licensing. There's a settlement of that. I think that turns out not to be super interesting. We certainly don't have time to talk about it. In 1998, they bring what we think of as the middleware case. Netscape goes public in August of 1995. Microsoft responds to Netscape. And the government sees Microsoft as as using its incumbency and its existing position in operating systems to, as it were, try to maintain that monopoly against the threat that Netscape poses. And the government wins that case. That case is heard at a district court and then at a court of appeals. And Microsoft wins 7-0 in the court. Microsoft loses 7-0 in the court of appeals. So a huge success for the government. At the same time, technology is taking place elsewhere. And that technology here is Google. Larry Page, Sergey Brin, they're Stanford computer science graduate students. They come up with this idea for a new search engine called Google. They think they've got a better way to do it. If you haven't read this paper, read the paper, but especially read the appendix, because the appendix talks about the difficulty of using advertising to finance this kind of structure, which of course is exactly what they end up doing. All right, so all of it's happening. We're litigating with Microsoft. Eventually, Microsoft loses, and the question is what to do. And we thought for a moment about breaking up Microsoft. And that would have split Microsoft into sort of an applications company, into an operating system company. We backed away from that. So when I talk about breakups in the United States today, I say, oh, our last two breakup moments were the breakup of AT&T in 1982/1984 and the non-breakup of Microsoft in 2000. I think those are both data points that you need to have in mind as you think about what breakups might look like today. All right, I've got one more issue I want to talk through quickly, and then we'll be done. So I haven't gotten to Apple at all. The Apple story is a remarkable story. This is from the Wall Street Journal when they hit $1 trillion in market capitalization. What I really want you to see is how low it is from here to here. Apple basically dies in 1996. Steve Wozniak's gone. Steve Jobs is gone. Eventually, Jobs comes back. But before Jobs got there, Apple, John Sculley was the CEO of Apple at this point. He had a vision for what would happen next. And those would be handheld devices, and you would interact with them with a stylus. This was called the Apple Newton. And if you know your computer history, the Apple Newton is one of the great fiascos. And it just shows you sometimes technology is too early. Sculley had the right vision as to the kind of devices we wanted. He simply did not have the technology to deliver it. A pre-internet device, a pre-Wi-Fi device, and the Newton was a failure. But what was a success was the iPod. So Apple releases the iPod in 2001. That is the device which takes Apple to be on the path that it is today. In 2007, of course, they released the iPhone. The world we live in today is the culmination of these great three trends. Moore's Law, the transistor arc that AT&T launched in 1947. The internet, which ARPA launches really in 63, then in 69, and that continues to grow. And then really the wireless world, where again I want to give the FCC a lot of credit for the auction system they ran out. Apple took that moment, took the technology, and designed, this device. And there were smartphones before that, and you can look at the market share of Nokia and their Symbian operating system and RIM and BlackBerry, and all of that gets killed by a superior technology. And obviously, Google buys Android and heads down exactly that same path. That's the world we live in today. Now, this is, as you can see, is from July 23rd, 2019. DOJ, United States DOJ, has announced that they're going to do an investigation of these online platforms. This is happening across the world. So I think we're at a very interesting moment there. I hope I've made a successful pitch for why I think understanding this history matters. I think to some extent we occasionally exaggerate the effects of the 1956 settlement. We certainly exaggerate, I think, some of the good effects. Those might have happened elsewhere with AT&T. I think we underplay the quarantine consequences sometimes. The 1969 lawsuit against IBM, I think, actually turns out to matter, even though the government dismisses that 13 years later, and it sort of looks like a failure. But I don't think that really fairly captures that. The Microsoft lawsuit, I think there's a big question, which is, would Microsoft have responded differently to Google if that lawsuit hadn't been going? And I don't know the answer to that. I do think we're at a particularly interesting antitrust moment, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about some of that in questions. Thanks. Really enjoyed doing that.